The first impression one gets of this book is that it is a humanist book. It's written from a humanist perspective, from a liberal perspective, the kind of person who believes in liberal democratic principles, from the kind of person who believes in individual liberties and freedom of speech, perhaps even, or individual choice. Maybe he would be a draft dodger or an opponent of conscription in another age. But of course, in 1941, he wants all out war, and he'll explain why pretty clearly. Uh, and of course, it's important to note that he's not just fighting for freedom, he's actually fighting for peace. He wants America to fight for freedom and for peace and for liberal democracy worldwide. And that's why he wants them to go to war. Germany must perish presents a plan for the structure of a permanent and lasting peace among civilized nations. It bases its thesis on the eventual defeat of Germany by the British Empire and its allies without the assistance of the United States. However, should circumstances decree that the American public cast its ballot in favor of war as a measure of self-defense, and it is the fervent prayer of the author that this may never happen, it would become paramount that the lives of our native sons not be sacrificed in vain, as were our fathers' lives a generation ago. So, of course, at this point in time in American history, there's only about 20 years prior that millions of men marched off to the First World War to die in a European war, the kind of European war which their own forefathers had fought and died to not be a part of in the Revolutionary War or the War of Independence. Indeed, the founding of their republic, of their nation, of the American people, so to speak, was the idea that they were not European, that they were a breakaway colony, that they were their own society, that didn't believe in old nation states and in monarchies and empires, but they believed in democracy and in liberty and in republican principles of government. Um, they were an Enlightenment society, in a sense. And they didn't believe in this kind of backward and reactionary warfare. And they were rather opposed to getting involved in any kind of war, for the most part. And indeed, they still are, frankly, no matter how bellicose their foreign policy becomes. If our soldiers must go forth to kill or die in battle, at least let them be given not alone a slogan, but a solemn promise and a sacred promise. Let that purpose be an enduring peace. And this time that promise must be kept. So he wants war for peace. If anybody's above the age of 20 listening to this, you'll remember the wars for peace that went on in Iraq and Afghanistan and resulted in precisely no peace whatsoever, of course, which America engaged in, and Britain and France, and a few other NATO countries. And you'll also remember that they fought for democracy. So they fought for freedom and, in some cases, feminism, and in some cases, homosexual rights and LGBTQ rights and so on in the Islamic world. And they were led by a certain faction of people called the neoconservatives, who were mostly former Trotskyites, former Marxists, most of them. Well, in terms of the leaders, all of them. And they rallied public support behind these wars in the Middle East, which had nothing to do with American foreign policy whatsoever. They're literally across an entire ocean. I mean, they couldn't get to America if they tried. They really couldn't. They pushed for war even before 9/11 with these countries, which neighbor a very special country, which could even be chosen by God, perhaps even. And yeah, and millions of people died. And not for the interests of the American people either. And well, this is a very similar situation, in my opinion. It's a very similar situation. And they used very, very similar propaganda to get them involved. So basically, he wants to fight for democracy, peace, and freedom. And he wants to fight for democracy, peace, and freedom in a rather reactionary fashion, to be honest. Um, the title of the book, if it's not obvious to you yet, the title of the book is Germany Must Perish. And it'll become very clear what happens, what he wants to happen in just a moment. So he says, today's war is not a war against Adolf Hitler, nor is it a war against the Nazis. It is a war of peoples against peoples, of civilized peoples envisioning light against uncivilized barbarians who cherish darkness. So again, this is a rather it's interesting. The neocons used some very reactionary rhetoric as well to gin up war fervor among the American people. They said that these Palestinians, these Afghanistans, these Muslims, they're savages, and we should conquer them and force them to live in a democratic fashion. They'll be thankful for our help in conquering and dominating them and slaughtering many millions of them, because then they'll have democracy like we do. So they said, and feminism, of course, it's very important. Well, this is a very similar rhetoric, as we can see. The Western democratic powers, France, Britain, America, Scandinavia, are the civilized peoples of the world because they're democratic, because they live in liberal democracies, essentially. Of the peoples of those nations who would surge forward, hopefully, into a new and better phase of life, pitted against the peoples of a nation who would travel backward enthusiastically into the Dark Ages. It is a struggle between the German nation and humanity. This is like the first page of the book. We're talking about a struggle between the German people and civilized humanity. Now, of course, in the 1940s, these kind of strong words were less grating to the ears of the general public. So it's not as shocking as we would see it today, where this guy is calling for, basically denouncing an entire nation as a threat to peace and civilization itself. That was relatively more acceptable in the 1940s, obviously. But at the same time, rather reactionary rhetoric for such a liberal humanist, don't you think? He pits the democratic spirit of the Western powers against the authoritarian and backward and reactionary anti-democratic sentiment of the German people. And specifically the German people, not the Prussian aristocracy who ruled over Germany, not their leaders in the parliament. No, literally the German people themselves. And we'll see a huge amount of rhetoric aimed precisely against the German people as a nation, as a people themselves. So he says, Hitler is no more to be blamed for this German war than was the Kaiser for the last one, nor Bismarck before the Kaiser. These men did not originate or wage Germany's wars against the world. They were merely the mirrors reflecting centuries-old inbred lust of the German nation for conquest and mass murder.